Saturday, June 18th, 2022. I'm Larissa, and this is Songbird at Rest by Larissa Dahroug. Chapter 2. Rammed Earth. Beth and Johan were beside themselves with frustration. They had been out to the site twice, and the offer was solid. It was even $75,000 over asking price. They had offered so much to be sure the transaction would go through. Johan had been reading up on local probate law. They knew the potential value of what they were looking at, and the extra $75,000 wouldn't even begin to cover the price jump that was bound to come in the next 12 to 24 months. Johan had been tracking the area for almost a decade now, and Beth trusted his instincts as much as she trusted her EpiPen. Plus, it wasn't like he just pulled the area out of a hat. It was the town where he lived while doing his doctoral studies. He lived there for a good 5 years and only moved away because Sachs wanted him in the office on the East Coast. That's where he and Beth had met. She was the on-site massage therapist for corporate. After subprime, Johan had walked away quietly with a very, very large sum that even Beth wasn't sure of the exact amount. All she knew was she basically did as she pleased so long as she was reasonable about things. She had never been a frivolous person anyway, and didn't need designer labels or extravagant vacations. She was just fine with living in mostly the same manner she had before meeting Johan, and Johan had never been a particularly flashy kind of guy either. His job had always been just that, a job. He never got overly involved in the socializing or snobbery of the banking world, and he was good enough at what he did that no one questioned his choice of attire or reason for declined lunch dates. Johan was the one they consulted for a final decision on an investment. It wasn't his PhD. His degree wasn't even in a related field. His degree was in anthropology, specifically the evolution, trade, and development of agricultural tools on the North American continent. Knowing the potential of an investment and the authenticity of people and organizations was more of a natural talent. It had started as a side hustle of sorts in undergrad, with him accompanying an old high school buddy to backroom bar meetings as backup just in case, as well as to keep an eye out for things his buddy might miss about those with whom he was doing business. Johan could tell when someone was lying, and he often had an almost supernatural insight into why they were lying. It made for a fruitful business partnership, and when Ben had gotten his first firm partnership, he brought Johan along with him. Johan never missed. His broad build and stoic expression, coupled with his almost unnaturally blonde hair and ice-colored eyes, was formidable and did the trick when it came to deterring violence. But the truth was, he had never even so much as ever been in a fistfight in his life. His presence was simply unusual enough to make others question whether or not they wanted to find out if he would do them harm. Plus, he was always correct in his assessments of hearts and situations. Beth liked that he enjoyed her Swedish-style massage, and the way he always treated her on par with everyone else he worked with, which was professional, fair, and discreet. She definitely would not have said that about many of the other clients she saw in the office. Beth was the one who asked Johan out the first time. She waited until after he was dressed after a session and asked over the paper cup of water she handed him. It was the first time she'd ever seen him smile, and she fell in love. He told her he had been wanting to ask her for months, but hadn't wanted to breach any company policy or have her think it was just because she touched his naked body. He truly enjoyed their conversations. Beth didn't converse with her clients unless they initiated it during sessions. Most people didn't say much. Johan liked to talk about how his father had built his childhood home with his own hands and how he had even made many of the tools he used. Johan knew a lot about how things were made and how people could or should make things as opposed to machines. He also knew a lot about where materials came from and the history of trade and cultures from all over the world. Part of it was because of his studies, but his understanding and motivation came from a much deeper place of gnosis, because of his father and their relationship. After their third date, Johan had asked Beth if she would like to stay the night with him. They were both in their late 30s at the time, and beyond the immaturity of mind games, she accepted and stayed. They had talked all night over beer Johan had brewed himself about the tools in his workshop. Many of them were ones his father had made. Some Johan had made, and some were handmade by people from exotic places for very specialized tasks. Beth found it enthralling. Johan seemed to be able to build anything, fix anything, do anything, and she loved touching him, both professionally and personally. When the sun came up, they were sitting on the couch still talking. Johan decided to make breakfast, and Beth asked to use the shower. When she stepped out of the shower into the bedroom, he had a beautiful breakfast of fresh fruit, Danish, and honey arranged next to the bed on a carved pedestal table he had made. He approached her with a clean, warm, snow-white towel and dried her body before picking her up, placing her on the bed, and feeding her, waiting until she was full before he spread her thighs and enjoyed his own breakfast. Later that day, they went back to her small, dark apartment, packed her few belongings, and brought them back to his home. A month later, they were married by a justice of the peace, without any fanfare. That had been 15 years ago. She had never known happiness until Johan, and Johan had never truly trusted anyone other than his father, until Beth. They were perfect for each other. The real estate agent handling the transaction was very typically West Coast, vague and cheerfully insulting. They had yet to meet the seller and couldn't understand why he was reluctant to answer some of their questions. In particular, they wanted to know if he was willing to remove the remaining parts of the structures on the property as part of the deal. Johan wanted a clean slate to work from, and nothing that remained from the fires was worth repairing or conserving other than the well. The agent had always had some excuse about why he wasn't returning calls in a timely manner. They knew there weren't a lot of offers on the surrounding properties. Johan still had lots of friends in banking, so he knew such things. Interest had been mostly by children of locals who had properties that survived, but none of them seemed to have the money to buy anything, and instead were going to wait for their parents to die and inherit. People were bitter and cold to those they viewed as outsiders coming in to profit from their community misfortune. Johan was interested in this particular plot because it was mostly flat and the well was still intact. He said that was a huge deal. Beth loved him and believed him, and knew whatever he built for them would be beautiful and good. She was looking forward to having her own private massage studio, with passive solar-heated floors and rammed earth walls. That's what Johan wanted to build, rammed earth. The whole thing was painfully romantic. Johan, seated at the dining table he made himself, placed his cell phone between he and Beth, and stared at it as if it were an insolent child he was trying to not beat. Beth waited. She knew what the tone in Johan's voice meant, and was a bit frightened for the man who had been on the other end of the line. Finally, Johan released a forceful breath from his nostrils and raised his ice-colored eyes to meet Beth's green ones. Beth waited for him to speak. "I'm calling Bill," was all he said to her before picking up the phone and dialing once more. Bill worked for the FBI and was an old college buddy of sorts. They met when they were dating the same girl. Both had thought the relationship was exclusive. Bill was the one who had tracked Johan down on campus when he found evidence of the relationship. Bill had been a linguistics major, and Greta had been studying pottery excavation on an exchange program with a university in Amsterdam. Johan had met her taking an elective lecture class on pottery excavation. Bill had met her while he was volunteering at the university's Language Help Center for exchange students. Until the discovery of Johan's relationship with Greta, he had been planning to propose. After meeting Johan and finding out he had no idea Greta was already seeing someone, the two confronted her and dumped her together, then remained friends. "Something about this isn't right. I know they are hiding something, and it's big. Bill was able to find out what it is, and Bill will be able to find out what it is, and maybe we can get through this a little faster." "Okay, but keep in mind that Bill is a busy man, and you really should think about offering him some kind of compensation for his help, like maybe offer to watch the dog so he can take Donna on a real vacation sometime soon. That poor woman needs a break," Beth suggested. Johan nodded in agreement. Bill and Donna had an adult son with a severe case of Down syndrome who lived with them. He had been in a group home for a couple years, but had been asked to leave because he was not a very nice person. Not all people with Down syndrome are cheerful or nice. Some could be real jerks, just like anyone else. Donna had told Beth this herself. Bill's job took him all over the country, and Donna was left with Skylar and the dogs. Skylar stayed with Donna's sister on the odd occasion she had to leave town, but the dogs were more of a challenge. Bill didn't trust just anyone, given his line of work, and they had gone through 3 pet sitters in the past 10 years. Donna's sister lived in a 2-bedroom apartment and couldn't handle the 3 German shepherds. Beth gave both Donna and Skylar massage once a month. It brought her great joy to be able to bring a look of relaxation to her friend's face, and it always impressed her how tight and twisted Skylar's muscles felt under her hands. Donna told her that the massage helped Skylar's disposition for a few days after the treatment. It was a small but significant thing, and Donna always paid cash in appreciation. "Bill, it's Johan. How are things?" Beth couldn't hear what Bill was saying. She could only hear Johan's side of the conversation. "Is that so? Well, congratulations. We should have a couple beers when you get back in town. Hey, I need a favor." Johan paused while Bill replied. Beth pushed herself away from the table and went into the kitchen sink for a glass of water. The flowers Johan had brought her from the other day were on the windowsill, starting to wilt. Beth peeled a fallen petal back off of the sink and rolled it between her fingers and dropped it in the drain. She opened the cabinet to the right of the sink and pulled out 2 wide-mouthed jars and filled them from the tap. As she turned to go back to the dining room, Johan entered, stuffing the phone in his pocket. She extended a hand with a jar of water to him. He accepted it and took a drink. "Thanks. I needed that." "So what did Bill say? What are we congratulating?" "Oh, he finally found a front fender for that Impala he's been restoring. It's even silver blue poly, like his, so he won't have to sandblast the whole thing." Bill had a 1963 Chevy Impala that he inherited from an uncle and had been working on getting it back in shape for the past 10 years or so. Johan and Bill occasionally got together for beers and to sit around the car and play darts. Sometimes Skylar had a beer with him too, but beer usually only made him less agreeable. "Oh, well, that's good, I guess. What did he say? Is he going to look things up?" Beth took a drink of her water. "Yeah, he's out of town right now, but he said he can make a couple calls and it's not a big deal." "Did you offer about the dogs?" "Nah, he knows I'd help him anytime if he needed it." "Johan, I don't know that's true." "Sweetie, guys aren't the same as you women. He asked me when he needs help with the Impala, or like that time when he needed help pulling that old commode out of that basement." "Well, I'll mention it to Donna next time I see her. I think our appointment is next Monday." "You do that then. That's more of a woman-type conversation anyway." Johan finished his water and placed the jar in the sink behind Beth, who was still nursing hers. Beth finished her water and turned away from Johan, who was now rifling through some papers on the kitchen center island. She picked up Johan's jar and placed it with her own in the dishwasher to the left of the sink. "What do you think he's going to find?" Beth asked Johan without looking at him. "I'm not sure, but I for one would like to know a little more about this Jones fella selling the place. He's not a local and only recently acquired the property through an inheritance. That much that idiot real estate agent did tell me." Beth turned to look at her husband, who was now looking over a phone bill from the pile of papers stacked on the island. He sat the paper down and looked at his wife for a moment before approaching her with open arms. Beth buried her face in his warm chest and breathed him in as he wrapped his arms around her, kissing the top of her head. "Hey, you want to drive out to the site and have a picnic tonight?" Johan asked her softly. They had chosen to move out of the area 4 years previously for the weather and to be closer to Bill and Donna. Both were sick of renting. The only reason they had been renting was they weren't interested in buying anything unless they could see themselves dying there. It had to be exactly what they wanted. Johan had income from his investment portfolio, and Beth did massage at a couple spas, and then for a small group of personal clients. Sometimes Johan took custom jobs refurbishing antique wood furniture, and a local gallery had recently started carrying his originals. Most of their together time was spent at museums or wine tasting, or traveling to go to museums or wine tasting, or with a few close friends. It had been a little late for either when they married for children. She had always been kind of a loner. Her sister had 5 kids and lived back east with their mother, down the street from her, in fact. It was always more drama than Beth wanted or could handle. She was a very private person, and when she wasn't working, she enjoyed reading and translating French poetry. It was an odd hobby, but well paired with Johann's woodwork. He often found inspiration for designs in the pieces she translated. In particular, he enjoyed the erotic poetry when she came across it. It worked well to evoke sumptuous curves and oil-finished surfaces. Yes, was all Beth replied. Johan tipped her chin towards his face. Good, he said, and kissed his wife. Chapter 3. Relatively sanitized. Constance pulled the truck up against the remaining wall of the barn and pulled the now clean laundry from the passenger side. She hung the items that were still damp over a tree branch and put the rest of the folded items and sleeping bag in the greenhouse before dragging branches back over the truck. She left the jerry can on the floor of the passenger side. The generator was still at least half full, and she didn't want to tempt anyone wandering by with a full can of gas sitting out and about. Something wasn't right. She could see things had been moved around. The fruit basins weren't stacked where she had left them, and there was an empty bottle of champagne. She stomped over to where the basins had been moved. They were flipped over side by side, and one was covered in breadcrumbs. The empty bottle was on its side on the ground just next to her foot. She picked up the bottle. There was still a bit in the bottom. Voo, not cheap. Probably not the stoner boys from before. Voo was a far cry from the PBR in a joint. She sniffed the bottle before pouring the last mouthful down her own throat. It was delicious and still a little bubbly. Whoever had been there had left pretty recently, but they did, in fact, seem to be gone. Constance didn't see any other evidence of anyone being around. She wasn't sure where they had gone. The sun had already set behind the trees, and everything was now bathed in the eerie glow of just past dusk. The smell of the ash was overwhelming her. She decided she would sleep in the truck tonight, just in case whoever it was came back. But first she wanted to have some dinner. Constance walked over to the edge of where the trees had once been thick and started collecting broken branches and larger charred pieces of wood under her arm. She didn't need much. Once she was satisfied with the bundle under her arm, she piled it in the pit she and Tyson had dug their first night back on the property. Then she got the jerry can from the truck, sprinkled a small amount over the pile before using a cigarette lighter to light it. She had scavenged a cast-iron pot with a lid from the Jensen farm. In the pot, she put a potato she cut up with a pocket knife, some water, salt, and some greens and ramps she had collected the day before. Then she placed the pot covered in the center of the small fire. It would take about 40 minutes to cook. In the meantime, she retrieved the sleeping bag and laid it across the bench seat of the truck. Normally, she only slept in the truck when it rained, but not tonight. She wasn't sure what it was about this time with the champagne bottle, but something just seemed different. She had the feeling she might be in danger or lose her property for the first time since Tyson left so abruptly. She checked her watch and made her way back over to the fire and the pot. She was glad for the little bit of salt. It was the only flavor she could really rely on. A couple days before Tyson left, they had made a rather large purchase at a market of dry goods and supplies like salt, soap, lighters, coffee, feminine hygiene products, and other non-perishables. There had been some sugar, but squirrels or bugs or something had gotten it pretty quickly. It wasn't that big a deal once Tyson left. He was the only one who liked sugar in his coffee. She had always taken hers black. With him gone, Constance was having trouble remembering why she had stayed with him so long to begin with. She really was much better off without him. The constant complaining had gotten on her nerves rather quickly, and the weeks before Tyson had finally left were filled with near constant bickering. With him gone, there was less garbage to take care of as well. What little trash she created, mostly from her period, she burned. At first she tried burying it, but some animal had dug it up and made a disgusting mess. Tyson had berated her over it. After that, she just burned it. It was easier that way. She did the same with her fecal waste. She dug a hole with the shovel she found untouched against the remaining barn wall and used it for a couple days before digging a new hole. After a few days, things in one hole would kind of dry up, and then she would dig it out and burn it in the fire pit. It was a little smelly when it burned, but at least she could be sure everything was all relatively sanitized. Fire had a strange way of both making a mess and cleaning things. As she sat and ate her bland soup, Constance was struck by the silence of the land. It was something that had been bothering her now for some time. It had been months since she had heard or seen a single bird or insect. She should have picked up a paper when she was in town earlier. Maybe there was something about it in the news. Others must be noticing the same thing. It had been a while since she had been able to find any news on her smartphone. It seemed the only thing she was able to access was her bank account, and even that was hit or miss. The fire must have taken down cell towers, too. Other people who had ignored her in town Other than the people who had ignored her in town, the last people she had seen were the two boys in her tent. They were the last people to acknowledge her existence in any real way that she could remember, and that was around the last time she could remember the sound of birds or insects, or just about anything else now that she thought about it. The crackling of her small fire brought back the memory of the sound of the flames that were whipping through the trees around her house the night she and Tyson had fled along with all their neighbors. Now that sound was, ironically, her only friend. Maybe Tyson had tried to call her, but she just hadn't had reception. No, that couldn't be the case. She would have at least seen a message left or a record of the incoming call when she went into town, but there had been none. The champagne bottle glimmered in the firelight, and Constance wished she had saved it for after dinner. Alcohol was something she didn't waste money on nowadays, and she missed it. Her wine collection hadn't been large, but what had been destroyed in the fire had been very expensive and very delicious. It wasn't only antiques she was snobby about in her previous life. Everything now was framed in her mind as before and after the fire, or, more accurately, before and after Tyson left. It was like her whole outlook changed once he was gone. If someone had told her she'd be living this way a year ago, she would have written them off as a lunatic, but in all honesty, for the first time in her life, she actually felt totally free, even if a bit lonely from time to time. She felt natural, like she was part of the land and not just living on the land. It was peaceful, restful even. The pattern and reliability of tending only to her necessities was what a fish must feel like when it's swimming, or a flame must feel like when it's burning. She had never felt so alive as she did in the moment eating her bland soup under the stars, alone in the burnt-out remains of her once posh homestead. Fuck Tyson. He would never understood this. He was far too obsessed with creature comforts like take-out dinners and quilted toilet paper. He knew nothing of the satisfaction of mere sustenance or self-reliance. He needed his TV and his gadgets. Well, to be fair, she did have her phone still. But she viewed that as a necessary evil in a cruel modern world. It was just a tool, not a toy, like everything had always been. Like everything always seemed to have been for Tyson. The other thing that was on Constance's mind was her family. Not a single one had reached out in the days during or after the fire. They hadn't spoken in years, but if she had seen on TV that her mother's town had burned to the ground, she would have called to inquire. When they didn't reach out to her, she didn't bother to reach out to them either. It had been over a decade since great Aunt Millicent's funeral. Everyone had been enraged to learn she had left absolutely everything to Constance. She was never totally sure why they felt that way. It wasn't really a big surprise. Constance hadn't expected anything from her great aunt, but at the same time, she'd been the only one in the family who had any type of meaningful relationship with the woman. Aunt Millie had always been an eccentric woman with eccentric friends, interests, and affiliations. Constance had been fully expecting the majority of her great-aunt's small fortune to be left to some esoteric institution. When the document had been read and simply stated that all her earthly possessions and effects were left to Constance, Constance had been genuinely surprised. Aunt Millie had never discussed it with her, and she had never asked. Learning the antique business had been just that, business, and the only reason Millie had shared it with her was because they had a personal relationship. Constance's mother had stood up and proceeded to throw what could only be described as an adult temper tantrum at the reading of the will. Constance had been stunned. Her mother had always been so proper and calm. Her cousin, Denver, had actually attacked Constance from behind, pulling her hair and clawing at her face. It had been a shock, especially when her mother slapped her face and told her she was selfish if she didn't share with the rest of them. It wasn't like it was an obscenely huge inheritance. Millie was no ball player or actor, but the amount had been sizable nonetheless. What was really worth something was the client list, but Constance had access to that for years before Millie's death. They were, after all, business partners. Constance brought her fingertips to her cheek where Denver had scratched her so many years ago. It had healed and left no scar, but she could still feel it if she thought about it. Constance's father had died a few years after that. None of the family even told her. She found out by accident when she was on a trip to the East Coast to look at black-faced dolls a longtime client and fellow dealer were looking to sell. The client had actually gone to the funeral and expressed her surprise at not having seen Constance in attendance. Constance had tried to hide her shock, while saying she would have been there if she had known. The client patted her on her back and offered her condolences. In her hotel room that night, Constance had cried hot, bitter tears, and on her way home a few days later, she made an impromptu stop in her hometown to visit the gravesite. Grass had not even yet started to grow on the grave. She made a promise to her dead father to never forgive her mother or two younger sisters for their cruel exclusion. Sometimes Constance dreamed of her father, but it had been a long time since that had happened too, and in this moment it brought her a great sadness. The moon was now high in the sky, and the fire was out. Constance covered the coals with some dry dirt and used some of her water to wash her hands, feet, and face before crawling into the cab of her truck to sleep. It was a little cooler tonight than it had been the night before. She even left the window of the truck rolled up. Tomorrow was going to be a little busy. She would make a couple fried turkey eggs for breakfast, then dig a couple new holes for the toilet, burn the old waste, and cover the old holes. Then there were the seeds that needed to be planted to start the next round of veggies in the greenhouse. All of these things took time and energy, and she hoped she wouldn't need to deal with intruders, even if they did have decent taste in alcohol. Shall we do one more chapter? Let me see how many pages this next chapter is. Yeah, we'll do one more. Do one more. Why not? What else I got to do with my time? Right? Other than laundry and cook food, right? That's all I'm good for, is a fucking cow. Right? Is livestock, some man's livestock. Chapter 4. That's not part of that tirade wasn't part of the book. That was just my commentary. Chapter 4. Cinderella, dressed in yellow. Oh, I've had too much caffeine. Cinderella, dressed in yellow. He could feel Constance watching him. She was somewhere in the house, but he was never sure just where. The smell of the place between her ear and her neck in the morning overwhelmed him. Certainly, she was right there beside him. Then the wall gave way, and flames were all he could see. The sound of branches cracking and popping under the stress of the fire beat within his veins like his own heartbeat. He gasped for air, thrashing from right to left, searching for her. As his heart rate increased, he became more and more conscious until he was awake and aware of being safe in his own converted warehouse loft bedroom. For a moment, Tyson's arms and legs seemed glued to the mattress until he was fully awake and able to run his hands over his face and the top of his head. It was always like this. He had the same dream at least once a week, sometimes 2 or even 3 times. At first, it was every night. But the last 6 months, it had slowed some. It was exhausting, but as the occurrences of the dream became further apart, he at least felt it might one day stop altogether. He couldn't even really talk about it with anyone. Well, anyone but Kelly didn't count. He had been in on all of it from day one, and after the first 2 weeks of the dream, he had told Tyson to suck it up or get the fuck out. He was tired of hearing about it. That was the one thing he could say for Constance. She was far more patient a person than Kelly. If she had been born with outdoor plumbing, he may have even stayed with her. But he knew what he preferred, even if he could tolerate the other. Tyson reached for the glass of water on the nightstand, but in his haste knocked it over, spilling it on the hardwood floor. Edna downstairs was going to complain again for sure. He hated the old floors in this place. The landlord had been too cheap to insulate them when he refurbished it, and in some places you could even see between the wood slats into the unit below. Truth be told, he hated the whole place, but Kelly loved it, and it had enough space to reasonably store what he had been able to recover from the storage units he and Constance had kept in 3 different states on his trek back east. In the kitchen, He could hear Kelly banging about. Constance had believed Kelly to be both a woman as well as Tyson's sister. The name, coupled with the naturally lilting timbre of Kelly's voice, layered with his southern drawl, made it easy for Tyson to maintain their relationship all those years he was living with Constance. Constance never suspected. He used to tell Kelly he loved him right in front of her. Tyson swung his giant legs out of the king-size bed and plunked his feet on the floor to either side of the spilled water. One of Kelly's worn undershirts was hanging carelessly from the back of the chair next to the hamper. It was probably the one he had worn to bed last night. Tyson reached for it to sop up what of the water hadn't trickled down into Edna's unit. He could hear her TV on, so he knew she was home. It was just a matter of time before she came storming up to their door, demanding compensation for some dollar store treasure ruined by their inconsiderate acts on her person and property. She was a nasty little spinster with the eyes of a rat, thinning curly witchy hair, a mustache as thick as Tyson's father's had been, and at least 6 cats. She complained about everything. Thank goodness it had only been water this time. Last time they had Fred and Peter over for dinner and backgammon, Fred had dropped a tumbler of bourbon and it had dribbled on her head while she was watching Wheel of Fortune reruns. She had threatened to sue. Tyson paid for her to go to the salon and have her hair set. When she came home, it was the first and only time Tyson saw her when she was anything close to pleasant to look at. His friend Joachim told him not to refer any more clients after that. She had been rude to everyone in the salon and hadn't even bothered to tip, and Joachim had certainly worked a miracle. Tyson gave Joachim a marble-top Victoria side table that was in his way at the loft to help smooth things over. It had worked. Tyson washed his face, brushed his teeth, pulled on a well-worn pair of blue sweatpants, and meandered out of the bedroom loft to the kitchen area in the open floor plan. Kelly was chopping kale for a smoothie against an exposed brick backdrop. Copper pots hung from the ceiling-mounted rack above his head. Tyson wrinkled his nose and rested his left palm on Constance's favorite piece, a black walnut writing desk that had come out of a Massachusetts home that had supposedly belonged to John Hancock. It was quite beautiful, the wood having been waxed and oiled over and over throughout the centuries. It had a quality similar to that of an old Catholic church pew. "I don't know how you can put that in your mouth," Tyson said as Kelly dropped half a cucumber and a chunk of ginger on the top of the chopped kale and fastened the lid of the Vitamix. "I don't know how you munched stale old muff for all those years," Kelly replied nonchalantly without even looking up at Tyson. Tyson walked past Kelly to the sink and pulled a mason jar off the exposed shelf to the right of the sink and filled it with water from the tap. "I spilled water in the bedroom," he said, looking at the brick wall above the sink with his back still towards Kelly. The whir of the Vitamix stopped abruptly. Kelly whipped around to look at Tyson, who was slowly turning to meet his lover's eyes. "You didn't," Kelly pouted. "That old bat's going to be up here for sure with her knickers in a bunch." "Oh, stop it. It was just water, not a tumbler of bourbon, and we don't have to answer the door." "She can knock and holler all she wants. Besides, I don't even remember spilling anything anymore. Maybe one of her cats peed." Kelly laughed and kissed Tyson on the tip of his nose. "You're funny. Yeah, maybe one of those flea bags of hers left some commentary." Kelly turned around and turned the Vitamix back on. The green liquid swirled. The thought of it turned Tyson's stomach. He was all for yogurt and fruit smoothies. Hell, he even drank the kombucha, but he would never get the kale thing. What was wrong with collard greens and ham hocks? Kale was so northern. He drew the line the first time Kelly tried to force one of his kale concoctions on him. "I need to call Chaz," Tyson said, as flatly as possible. Kelly was now pouring the disgusting, slightly foamy green liquid into a chilled glass beer mug. "Well, when you talk to that California fairy, tell him he still owes me for those dishes I sent his aunt last month," Kelly said before chugging half the contents of the mug. "That's the least of our problems. The buyer is asking a lot of questions, and I don't want to talk to them." "What are you afraid of? It belongs to you. You have the paperwork." "I know. I just don't want to talk to them. I don't want to think about it anymore. I just want to be done, and I'm afraid Chaz is going to ask me to fly back out." But there's no reason to do that. That's what Overnight Express is for. Or hell, even that electronic document sign thing like I did for the Porsche last summer. I never had to talk to that bitch. Just the tow truck guy that came to pick it up. Kelly downed the rest of the smoothie and took the mug to the sink to rinse before the veggie bits dried like glue to the sides of the glass. Tyson finished his water and sat the mason jar on the island bar where they had sat to eat breakfast together on Sundays while they did the Times crossword. The dictionary was still out from last week. I just want to be done with it and have the money, then I won't have to think about it anymore. Well, it's not like she's going to call you, Kelly stated very matter-of-factly. Tyson sighed heavily and went to look out the front window onto the street below. August in South Carolina was humid. It was 9 in the morning, but he could already see heat waves wiggling up from the pavement, and the leaves of the poplar in the corner area near the front entrance of the building were turned upside down. I think it's going to rain, he said as he watched down in the building parking lot at three sisters jumping rope. Tyson recognized them from a family that lived on the ground floor. Dickinson girls are jumping rope in the parking lot. Kind of early for them to be out there alone. I wonder if Becca knows they're out there. Since when do you give a shit about any breeder's spawn? Kelly asked while shaking out a towel to fold from a basket of clean laundry. The comment stung Tyson a bit. He and Constance had been toying with the idea of a baby. A few months before the fire, they had a bit of a scare. But once she peed on the stick, all was safe. At her age, who knows what would have popped out. But for a few days, they had thrown around baby names. Aw, come on, Kel. Those girls are sweet, and Becca and Drew are good people. These streets aren't safe for any child, but pretty little girls like that? Tyson's voice trailed off as he watched the rope rhythmically slap the macadam and the youngest girl, called Teeny, spin around, doing some type of choreography with her sisters as they sang a schoolyard chant, passed down from girl to girl for decades. When he was a boy, Tyson used to like to jump rope with the girls at school. In his mind, he was jumping with Teeny, singing Cinderella, dressed in yellow, went upstairs to kiss her. Well, aren't they just a picture then, Kelly said over Tyson's shoulder, looking down at the girls. Tyson turned his face enough to kiss Kelly on the cheek. So, sweetie, other than the Chaz gremlin, what are your plans for today? Kelly asked in a slow, low, sugar-sweet voice, his hand smoothing over the round of Tyson's left buttock. Tyson brushed it away as he turned from the window towards the bedroom area. I don't know. And he really didn't. The sale of the property would bring in enough for him to live without needing to work for a number of years, maybe even the rest of his life if he were careful and made some shrewd investments. $1 went a whole lot farther in South Carolina than it did in Northern California. That was for damn sure. He didn't really know what to do with his time anymore, and it wasn't helping his mental state. Kelly saw his lover struggling and prodded him gently. Oh, come on, Shug. We've been waiting for this for a decade. It's our dream come true, and praise the sweet baby Jesus, that fire was a godsend. Sure fixed a whole lot for us. You need to start enjoying yourself, enjoying us, for crying out loud. Enjoy something. Fred said you're becoming a giant bore. Once the sale goes through, let's take a long weekend at Hilton Head. Or hell, let's really get out of town and go up to Rehoboth. All the kiddies will be back in school. It will even be safe to swim in the pool. Kelly followed Tyson as he climbed back to their bedroom, made private from the windows, with simple oak library shelves and 2 Gothic armoires Constance had brought back from a trip to Hungary 7 years ago. Tyson was standing in front of the armoire he used for his clothes, with the doors open, considering his wardrobe. I don't know, whatever you want. Tyson hated Hilton Head, but he hated Rehoboth even more. Delaware was so backward, and he most certainly wasn't interested in Myrtle Beach. About the only thing he missed about California was its beaches. They were nothing like East Coast beaches, at least not from New York down. Once you got up to New York and further north into New England, the beaches became more tolerable. He wasn't into boardwalks or people. Fat middle-aged women in neon bikinis were more than he could stomach. At least Constance had the good sense to wear a tasteful black one-piece when she did need to wear a suit. Tyson was more of a hot toddy and sweater watching the waves from an oceanfront diner with soft jazz in the background kind of beachgoer. California beaches were amazing and that many were challenging to get to, so once you did make the hike, you could very well be the only one out there. Then, of course, there were the cliffside eateries looking out over the Pacific in so many towns. But both California beaches and New England beaches were a far cry from the meat market fashion show tourist traps like Wildwood Crest, Myrtle, Hilton, or Rehoboth, and Florida was like another country. Wear the blue one today. I love that one on you, Kelly said as Tyson fingered a natural beige button-down linen shirt Constance had bought for him for his birthday from a vendor at a trade show the year before the fire. She had gotten him a beige one, black one, and a blue one. All were made from hand-woven linen textile. They were beautiful. Constance had impeccable taste. Okay, Tyson plucked the blue shirt from next to the beige one and a pair of loose-fitting, distressed blue jeans and threw them on the bed. From a flat-woven basket on one side of the shelves, he pulled clean undergarments and tossed them next to the jeans and shirt. Seriously, Shug, what are you going to do today? Kelly asked innocently. Tyson was normally pretty even-tempered, but this morning he was working hard to hold it together. Between the dream and the thought of Chaz and the girls jumping rope, he wanted to be somewhere, anywhere else. And he didn't want to answer any questions. He turned to Kelly with fire in his eyes. I don't fucking know. Get off my back about it. Why do you care? What the fuck are you doing today? Tyson spat before grabbing a fresh towel and washcloth from the shelf behind Kelly's shoulder and turning toward the bathroom. If Kelly was surprised by the outburst, he made no indication. Well, no reason to bite my head off about it. I was just wondering because you've been laying about the house for the past 2 weeks and I'm starting to worry. Plus, I want to go to Target to buy some cleaning supplies and would like to use your Suburban, not the convertible. After Kelly sold his Porsche, he bought a '93 cherry red BMW convertible. Tyson never understood it. The Porsche was a nicer looking car and in better shape, but that was Kelly. He said something about not wanting to appear to put on airs. It made no sense. Yeah, you can take the Suburban, but it needs gas. Tyson's Suburban was a 2003 and in decent shape. He had bought it used in California just before he left, so he could hitch a bigger trailer to clean out the storage units. He had traded in a much newer Civic to get it. A much newer Subaru to get it. He would have just taken the Tundra, but it smelled like Constance, and he didn't want the reminder, so he left it with her. That was nearly 6 years ago now. Kelly rolled his eyes at Tyson and climbed down out of the bedroom. Of course it does. He tossed over the ridge, where the ladder met the bedroom floor as Tyson stepped into the shower. Oh my goodness gracious. Pollen count is high today. It's not my iced tea because this is more rhubarb. There's more rhubarb in here than there is black tea. So it can't be that. I haven't had that much caffeine to make my nose itch. It has to be the pollen count. Humidity was high this morning. It was for around here, and I'm really sensitive to it. I could barely sit up. It was hard. Oh, now my face is itching like crazy. I'm gonna have to go inside. The pollen's too high. Anyway, I can see it. I can see the pollen. There's like a yellow haze around some of the plants. Yeah, I'm very familiar with the East Coast. Very, very familiar with the East Coast. Anyway, we'll get to the next chapters next time. I need a break.